Let me ask you about Ukraine, and I know you're going to be careful, but I want to ask you something that I think you have both knowledge and authority on and can speak about, which is the charge that Donald Trump makes about Joe Biden is that Biden was trying to get the Ukrainians to fire the chief prosecutor. A lot of experts and media reports say that was a demand being made by the Europeans, by the United States. It was all part of an effort to rid Ukraine of corruption, and the argument was this guy was himself thoroughly corrupt and therefore he had to go. Do you recall that process, and do you think it's fair to say that what Biden was doing was asking for something that essentially the world was asking in firing this prosecutor?
I don't recall all of the specifics about the specific individuals, but it's certainly true to say that the British view, I think in common with the American view, was that Ukraine needed to do more to tackle corruption. That Ukraine actually is a country with a huge potential and success. It's a big country, a big population. It could be as wealthy and successful as a country like Poland, its neighbour, which is now many times richer than Ukraine. And our view was, we're helping you in terms of your defence, and we're helping in terms of standing up to the Russian aggression, but you need to help us by dealing with corruption in your country. And that was a common theme with all the interactions that I had, particularly with President Poroshenko, who was president of Ukraine for most of my time in office.
Many people told me at the time that you and Angela Merkel were the two staunchest defenders of the idea that you had to be tough on the Russians for the invasion of Ukraine, for the annexation of Crimea, that you had to keep sanctions in place, that a lot of other European leaders wanting to do business with Russia were more comfortable getting rid of the sanctions. Do you worry that the European Union and the West will not stay firm, particularly with all this complexity of what's happened in Ukraine, and that the Russians will be able to get away with it?
I do worry about it. I mean, my view was simple, that when it came to the Russian incursion into Georgia, which happened some years before Ukraine, the Western response was weak. We made a fuss for a small amount of time, but there were no proper sanctions, no proper measures, and Angela Merkel and I and others were determined, when Russia took advantage of the situation in Ukraine and basically stole a piece of territory, that there would be permanent consequences. We knew we couldn't militarily reverse what had happened, but we could put in place sanctions, and we worked very closely linking the EU with the US and putting in place sanctions at the same time, in the same way. And I think it's very important we keep that up. I think it's the only language that Putin understands on this issue of what he considers his near abroad, but what I consider to be countries that want a free and democratic and European future.
In a survey conducted 5 years ago, 84% of Americans could not locate Ukraine on a map. Given Russia's invasion of Crimea and this week's whistleblower news, I hope that number has come down significantly. Look at the map. It is here, by the way. Anyway, this nation that is now on our front pages every day is still an enigma to many. Let me bring in Anne Applebaum. She has just returned from Kiev and wrote a book on the former Soviet Republic called Red Famine: Stalin's War on Ukraine. And let me ask you, what has the level of backlash been or reaction for Zelensky, the new president of Ukraine, once particularly the transcript or the readout of this phone call between him and Trump became public?
It's important to take a step back and remember that for the past 30 years, almost 30 years, the United States in Ukraine and in the rest of the post-Soviet space has been advocating the rule of law, judicial independence. We've been arguing over and over again that Ukraine should have independent prosecutors, that the legal system needs to be depoliticized in order to end corruption. And this scandal, this story, which, by the way, of course people in Kiev have known about for the last couple of months, the scandal, has shown that the United States practices precisely the kinds of distortions of the law, precisely the kinds of politicization of justice and the legal system that Ukrainians have been trying to get out of their own system for the last decade. So first of all, the scandal and And the distress is shock at what's happening in the United States. This looks to a lot of Ukrainians like a very familiar activity. President of the country trying to use use the legal system, putting pressure on another country in order to achieve a political goal, in order to get dirt or compromat, as they would call it, or a fake story about one of his opponents. So that's the main reaction. For Zelensky himself, I think there's a lot of sympathy for him. He was in an impossible position. He was, on the one hand, being asked to do something that he knew was illegal. He knew that there was no story about Joe Biden. On the other hand, clearly he doesn't want to anger the President of the United States, and he's trying to walk a kind of line in between. But as the story develops, I'm sure people will, their views will begin to change.
In the phone call, it's clear that Zelensky is walking this fine line, as you say. He doesn't ever really agree to the demands that Trump makes. He sort of obfuscates them. But he also praises Trump and tells him he stayed at his hotel and things like that. So, and then later on denied that he felt pressure. I mean, at some level, he's in a no-win situation, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It looks to me, from looking at that transcript, and this is just a guess, that he's been advised to say some of those things. There are other world leaders who've had experience speaking to Trump. And there's certainly the perception that what you need to do when you talk to the American president now is flatter him, talk about his hotels, say that you stayed in one of them. And it's clearly an attempt to, clearly an attempt to, to try and get in with the United States president, even though, as I say, of course he knows, as he repeated in the last couple of days, that there is no case to investigate, that the story about Joe Biden is phony, and that the additional story, which is this, the Trump on that call, and also went on about something about a server being in Ukraine and some Ukrainian involvement in the 2016 election and all that. Everybody knows that's not true. It's a kind of conspiracy theory that Trump has picked up. We're not sure from where. And again, Zelensky, of course, knows this, but he has to avoid saying that directly to the United States president because he's the United States president. I mean, and this is a profoundly corrupt situation that is weirdly familiar to Ukrainians because it's the kind of thing they've been trying to get out of their system. In other words, they've been trying to get at, this use of conspiracy theory in politics, the politicization of the legal system. All that is something that Ukrainians have been trying to persuade their leaders to change for a decade.
What does this all look like from Vladimir Putin's perspective?
So look, this is exactly the kind of story that is wonderful for Vladimir Putin. Putin's line, if you watch Russian media, if you've watched Russian media over the last several years, you will see over and over again an implication, a story. Okay, Russia might be corrupt, but the country that's really corrupt, it's the United States. You might hear lines like, okay, the Americans talk a lot about democracy, they talk a lot about, independent judges, all that, but really, they're a country just like us. And this scandal, this story, fits perfectly into this particular Russian narrative. The story that U.S. is corrupt, Ukraine is corrupt, everybody's corrupt, we're all cynical, and so it's okay that the Russian state is profoundly corrupt as well. This is an ideal line. There are some indications that some of the odder details that you heard on that call, again, the mention of some kind of server in Ukraine, some kind of Ukrainian who's responsible for the 2016 election, some of that may, one way or another, have come from Russia. Those are scandals. Those are conspiracy theories that have appeared in some of the more conspiratorial websites in the United States, and some of it may even come from Russia.
Anne Applebaum, always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks.